Your daughter will never see a single ray of light, Mr. Harper. She is blind, and there is nothing anyone can do. Those words had been spoken years ago by the most trusted doctor Elliot Harper could find, and they had never left him. They were cruel in their finality, stripping away hope with a certainty that felt like a death sentence. Every time Elliot replayed them in his mind, the wound opened again, raw and merciless. Friends, before I go deeper into this story, I want to pause for a moment. Tell me where you are watching from, share it below, and while you're here, make sure you subscribe to the channel and give this video a like so you never miss powerful stories like this. Now let us step into Elliot Harper's world, a world where grief and silence lived side by side with wealth and brilliance. Elliot was once the golden boy of Silicon Valley, the man who revolutionized agriculture by fusing AI with farming. His name was attached to innovation that transformed vineyards across Napa Valley, predicting harvests with uncanny precision, automating irrigation, even designing drones that could detect disease in vines before the human eye could. He had everything: awards, billions in wealth, respect from peers who once doubted him. Yet none of that mattered when tragedy struck. The plane carrying his wife, Clara, went down when Isabel was barely a week old. The same accident left Elliot with a daughter the doctors said would never see the world, and it left him a man broken in ways he could not repair. The Harper estate stood as a monument to both success and sorrow. From the outside, it was a marvel: glass walls reflecting the vineyards, polished stone floors, minimalist decor that magazine editors praised. But inside, it was a mausoleum of grief. Silence pressed in from every corner, broken only by the faint hum of machinery or the soft sound of a little girl humming to herself. Elliot had withdrawn completely. He stopped attending conferences, stopped traveling, even stopped answering calls from investors who still wanted his genius. His entire life narrowed to Isabel, the fragile child he could not save from darkness. Isabel Harper was 6 years old now, with delicate hands that clutched a stuffed rabbit worn from years of constant touch. She did not run, did not play, did not laugh the way children should. She spent hours sitting by the wide windows, staring with unfocused eyes at a world she was told she would never truly know. To most, she appeared unreachable, silent, and lost in her own world. Elliot devoted himself to her, fiercely protective, yet his devotion was shadowed by guilt. He blamed himself for encouraging Clara to take that flight, for putting work before family, for believing money and medicine could protect them. Now he lived as half a man, defined not by his billions but by the constant ache of failure. It was into this heavy silence that Maggie Sullivan walked. She was hired as a housekeeper, but her role quickly became something more. Unlike others who had come before her, Maggie carried her own sorrow. She had lost her infant son to illness, and the grief had left a mark in her eyes that Elliot recognized instantly. She did not fill the air with chatter or try to force cheerfulness. Instead, she moved gently through the house, arranging flowers, folding blankets, and humming soft tunes as she worked. She carried herself with quiet dignity, and though she kept her pain private, it made her attentive in ways others were not. Maggie began noticing details everyone else overlooked. Isabel's head tilted when shadows shifted across the wall. Her small fingers paused when a sudden flash of sunlight hit the floor. Once, when Maggie dropped a spoon that glinted in the light, she thought she saw Isabel's eyes flicker toward it, however briefly. The moment was so subtle it could have been dismissed, but Maggie's instincts told her otherwise. She had learned the hard way to trust those instincts. With her son, she had sensed his illness before doctors confirmed it. Now, watching Isabel, her heart whispered that the girl's blindness might not be as complete as they believed. Still, Maggie hesitated. Elliot had built his life around the certainty of that diagnosis. Doctors had insisted Isabel was blind. Who was she, a grieving housekeeper, to question their authority? Yet her observations kept piling up. She noticed Isabel tapping her fingers in rhythm when soft music played in the background. She saw the faintest curve of a smile when morning sunlight touched the child's face. These were not random reflexes. They were signs of awareness, signs that something within Isabel was reaching for the world. One evening, Maggie entered Isabel's room while Elliot worked late in his study. The child sat on her bed, humming softly, rabbit pressed close. Maggie crouched low, speaking gently. "Isabel, sweetheart, I'm just here to keep you company." To her surprise, the humming stopped. Isabel tilted her head, as though listening. Maggie placed her hand on the bed's edge. After a long pause, she felt tiny fingers brush against hers. The touch was not clumsy or accidental, it was deliberate, cautious, filled with intention. Maggie's breath caught. That small gesture was like a spark of light in a pitch-dark room. She whispered, her voice trembling, "I'm right here." From that moment, Maggie could no longer dismiss what she saw. Isabel was not unreachable. There was something there, something that needed to be uncovered. Maggie began keeping careful notes in a small notebook, recording every reaction. She did not yet share her thoughts with Elliot, knowing he feared the pain of false hope more than anything else. He had built walls around his heart, and she knew how fragile hope could feel when you had already lost so much. Elliot, meanwhile, found himself noticing Maggie in ways he had not expected. Not with romance, but with recognition. Her presence carried a weight that balanced his own. For the first time, he did not feel entirely alone in his grief. When she spoke quietly of her son, he heard the same sorrow that lived inside him. And when she hinted, cautiously, that Isabel might sense more than the doctors believed, he brushed it aside out of fear. Hope was dangerous. Hope could crush you. But Maggie's patience left an imprint, and small moments began to gnaw at his certainty. Within the cold, perfect walls of his mansion, something fragile began to stir. Maggie's conviction grew stronger with each passing day, and though Elliot resisted, he too began to see faint glimmers he could not explain. Isabel's stillness was not the whole story. Beneath the diagnosis, beneath the silence, there was something alive, something waiting. And though no one else dared to believe it, Maggie did. This was the beginning of a journey none of them could have foreseen, a journey that would test their courage, shake their trust in authority, and ultimately lead them to truths buried in darkness. For Elliot Harper, for his daughter Isabel, and for Maggie Sullivan herself, the shadows of solace were only the beginning, the first step toward light that none of them yet imagined. Maggie Sullivan could not ignore the signs anymore. Something deep within her told her that Isabel Harper's story was not as final as the doctors had declared, and though she had tried to dismiss her own observations, they only grew clearer with each passing day. It began with the way Isabel tilted her head toward the shifting shadows on the wall, or the way her eyes seemed to flicker when light broke suddenly across the room. Maggie started to test these small suspicions in quiet ways, never enough to alarm Elliot, but enough to strengthen the voice inside her heart that whispered this child was not fully blind. One morning, when the Napa sun streamed through the glass walls of the Harper estate, Maggie carried a small flashlight she had tucked into her apron pocket. While Isabel sat with her rabbit clutched to her chest, Maggie knelt a few feet away and turned the beam on, sweeping it slowly across the girl's face. To her astonishment, Isabel's eyelids trembled, then her gaze shifted ever so slightly toward the glow. It was faint, but it was real. Maggie's breath caught in her throat, her heart racing as though she had witnessed a miracle. She repeated the experiment days later in different ways, reflecting sunlight off a spoon, letting the flicker of a candle dance across the floor, and each time she saw the same subtle response. Isabel was not entirely blind. Something inside her was still reaching for the light. Maggie began documenting everything, her grief-creased hands filling pages in a small leather notebook with notes and times and descriptions. She felt almost guilty keeping it from Elliot, but she knew the man was fragile. His love for Isabel was fierce, but it was tied to years of disappointment and guilt, and she feared what a false hope might do to him. Still, Maggie's determination grew, fueled by her own need for redemption after losing her son. She could not bring her own child back, but perhaps she could save this one from a fate of unnecessary darkness. Her determination soon drew suspicion. Dr. Evelyn Carter, the polished consultant who oversaw Isabel's care, had grown wary of Maggie's attentiveness. Evelyn carried herself with the calm authority of someone who expected obedience. She dressed sharply, spoke little, and her every glance seemed to measure and judge. During one of her visits to the estate, Evelyn watched Maggie carefully, her cold eyes narrowing as she noticed the housekeeper paying unusual attention to Isabel's reactions. "You're not here to play nurse," Evelyn said coolly one afternoon, her words edged like glass. "Stick to your duties. Mr. Harper pays you to clean, not to meddle." Maggie lowered her eyes respectfully, but inside she felt the weight of warning. Evelyn's presence unsettled her. There was something about the woman's controlled tone, the way she never allowed Elliot to question the treatment, that set alarms ringing in Maggie's mind. Her suspicions only deepened when she stumbled upon a locked box in Isabel's room while tidying the shelves. It was tucked away, but not well hidden, and curiosity overcame her caution. Inside, she found several bottles of eye drops labeled with Dr. Leonard Vance's name. She lifted one bottle, her hands trembling as she read the label, cyclopentolate hydrochloride, in doses that looked far too high for a child. Maggie had no medical training, but the word gnawed at her. That night, she searched online, her hands shaking as she typed. What she found chilled her. Cyclopentolate was a drug used to dilate pupils during eye exams, but in heavy doses, it could cause blurred vision, sensitivity, even suppress normal sight. Maggie's breath came fast. Could it be that Isabel had been given these drops for years, not as treatment, but as a way to keep her blind? The thought was monstrous, yet the evidence was staring at her in black and white. She confided in her childhood friend Sarah Nguyen, a nurse at San Francisco General Hospital. Sarah listened with cautious eyes, taking the bottle from Maggie and examining it carefully. Days later, she called with confirmation. The concentration was dangerously high for long-term use, especially for a child. "This could absolutely suppress vision," Sarah said softly, her voice tight with anger. "Maggie, if this is what she's been given, then it's no wonder Isabel hasn't been able to see. This isn't treatment, it's harm." Maggie's chest tightened. Her instincts had been right. Isabel's blindness wasn't entirely congenital. Something darker was at work. From that moment, Maggie's resolve hardened. She began to watch Evelyn more carefully, noticing how the woman dismissed questions, how she steered Elliot away from alternatives, how she carried herself with the certainty of someone guarding a secret. Evelyn's words returned to her, "You're not here to play nurse." Maggie realized then that Evelyn wasn't just cold, she was hiding something. The knowledge filled her with both dread and courage. But the discovery also placed Maggie in danger. Evelyn sensed her doubt and began tightening her grip. When Elliot asked casual questions about Isabel's progress, Evelyn shut him down with condescending authority. She insisted the drops were essential, that removing them would risk permanent damage. Elliot, conditioned by years of trusting doctors, nodded along. Maggie, however, felt her blood run cold. Every fiber of her being told her the truth was being buried under clinical words and polite lies. Her notebook filled with careful entries: 9 o'clock in the morning, eyes tracked flashlight. 2:15 in the afternoon, head turned toward candlelight. 5:30 in the evening, smiled at reflection on spoon. Each entry was both a small victory and a weight of responsibility. The more proof she gathered, the more certain she became that Isabel's life had been stolen by the very people meant to protect her. The girl's stillness was not nature's decree, it was imposed. And if Maggie stayed silent, then she would be complicit too. One evening, after Elliot had retreated into his study, Maggie sat alone in her small room within the estate, staring at the bottle of drops on her nightstand. She thought of her son, of how she had once felt powerless watching his illness consume him. She had been helpless then, but she would not be helpless now. Isabel deserved a chance. Even if it meant crossing lines, even if it meant standing against Evelyn and the authority of doctors like Vance, she could not walk away. Elliot remained in the dark, still clinging to the certainty that his daughter's blindness was untouchable fate. He loved her, but he feared hope more than he feared grief. Maggie understood his fear, but she also knew the truth had already begun to unravel. Isabel's subtle responses, the toxic eye drops, the cold grip of Evelyn Carter, these were threads of a larger story waiting to be pulled apart. And Maggie, driven by her own grief and by a growing love for the quiet little girl, was ready to pull. The Harper estate, once a sanctuary of silence, had become a place of hidden battles. Each day Maggie carried her secret like a weight, pretending to be the quiet housekeeper while quietly gathering proof of a life stolen. She knew danger lurked behind Evelyn's watchful eyes, but she also knew that the first spark of truth had been lit. And though the fight ahead would be harder than anything she had faced, Maggie Sullivan was ready. For Isabel, for Elliot, and for the memory of her own son, she would not stop until the darkness was pierced. This was no longer just employment. This was a mission born of grief, courage, and unyielding love. Maggie Sullivan knew the moment of truth could no longer be delayed, for the evidence she had gathered weighed heavily on her heart, and though fear gnawed at her, she understood that silence would condemn Isabel Harper to a life of darkness that was not entirely hers. It began one quiet afternoon when Elliot sat in his study, shoulders hunched under the weight of years of grief and resignation, and Maggie entered holding the leather notebook in her trembling hands. Her voice was steady but her heart raced as she explained what she had seen, the way Isabel's eyes tracked light, the way her head turned towards subtle movement, the way her fingers paused at a flash across the room. Elliot frowned, the familiar wall of skepticism rising in his expression. He reminded her of the doctors, of the specialists, of the final words that had become his cruel mantra, "Your daughter will never see." But Maggie, with tears shimmering in her eyes, placed the notebook in front of him, each line written with care, every observation recorded with precision. Elliot scanned the pages, his lips tightening as he read, and then she placed the bottle of eye drops on his desk, her voice breaking as she revealed what Sarah Nguyen had confirmed, that the drops were not medicine at all but poison in disguise, that they contained levels of cyclopentolate that could suppress vision, and that they had been prescribed not to heal but to harm. Elliot's first reaction was anger, not at Maggie but at himself, for he felt the sting of guilt pierce him like a blade. How could he, with all his wealth and intelligence, have been so blind to the truth about his own child? He gripped the bottle in his fist, shaking, torn between fury and disbelief, but Maggie's steady eyes held him, urging him to see not just the evidence but the faint hope that shimmered in Isabel's small responses. That evening Elliot made a decision that would mark the turning point of their lives. He locked away the bottles of drops and refused to administer them again. For the first time in years, Isabel's daily routine changed. At first the difference was small, almost imperceptible, but then the subtle progress began. Isabel reached out her hand and touched the bright red toy car Maggie placed before her. She smiled faintly when the golden glow of late afternoon sunlight fell across her face, a smile Elliot had not seen in years. One morning, while Elliot poured himself coffee, Isabel whispered her first question in a soft, trembling voice, "Is that yellow?" The words cut through the silence of the mansion like a bell ringing in a cathedral. Elliot froze, tears welling in his eyes as the mug slipped from his trembling hand and shattered on the floor. He rushed to her, kneeling at her side, unable to believe what he had heard. Maggie stood behind him, her heart overflowing with both relief and fear, for though hope had been ignited, danger still lurked in the shadows. Dr. Evelyn Carter sensed the shift almost immediately. Her visits to the estate became sharper, her questions more pointed, her eyes colder. She confronted Maggie in the kitchen one afternoon, her voice low but seething. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. Stop now, or you'll regret it." Maggie held her ground, her hands steady even as her stomach twisted. Evelyn's words were not idle, they carried menace, and within days the threats began. Anonymous messages slipped under her door, "Leave while you can. Don't make this worse." Her car was vandalized one night, its tires slashed, the glass cracked. At the same time, false articles appeared online, accusing Elliot of neglecting Isabel, portraying him as a billionaire too consumed with work to care for his daughter, while Maggie was painted as a manipulative employee exploiting a vulnerable family. The smear campaign spread quickly across social media, amplified by accounts that seemed less than genuine. Elliot, long used to public attention, felt the sting of humiliation, yet beneath the anger he found something new: resolve. For years he had hidden behind silence, letting others dictate the narrative of his life. Now, with Isabel's small voice echoing in his heart, he refused to retreat. He hired a private investigator, a man seasoned in uncovering buried truths. Within weeks the threads began to unravel. Evelyn Carter was tied to Dr. Leonard Vance through a pharmaceutical company called Novogenics, a company with a history of questionable trials and shadowy funding. Payments had been traced from Novogenics directly into accounts linked to both Vance and Carter. What had seemed like isolated malpractice was revealed as part of a larger scheme, one that used vulnerable patients to test dangerous compounds under the guise of treatment. Elliot listened as the investigator laid out the findings, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. Each revelation was both a dagger of betrayal and a spark of clarity. He realized then that his grief had not only blinded him but made him compliant, easy to manipulate, willing to accept hopelessness because he feared disappointment more than he dared hope for change. As Isabel's vision continued to improve, the danger escalated. Evelyn confronted Maggie once more, this time on the estate grounds, her voice dripping with contempt. "Do you really think anyone will believe you? You're just a housekeeper with a tragic story, clinging to someone else's child because you couldn't save your own." Maggie's chest tightened, but she did not break. She looked Evelyn in the eye and said quietly, "You can't hide the truth forever. Isabel is proof enough." Evelyn's mask slipped for the briefest second, revealing the fear beneath her polished exterior. That fear made her reckless, and in her desperation she pushed harder, feeding more lies into the press, whispering rumors into the ears of investors, trying to crush Elliot's credibility before the truth could surface. But the truth had already found its voice in Isabel. Each day her progress grew more undeniable. She pointed at shapes, laughed at beams of light dancing on the floor, and began to draw clumsy but determined sketches with crayons Maggie placed in her hands. The child who had once lived in silence was beginning to emerge into the world, and with her emergence came strength for Elliot and Maggie alike. For the first time, the Harper estate filled with more than sorrow. It carried the sounds of fragile hope, of whispered questions, of soft laughter that echoed through the halls like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. Yet with every step forward came the shadow of danger. Maggie knew the threats were not idle. Elliot understood the storm building around them. And Evelyn Carter, caught in her own tightening web of lies and crimes, grew more dangerous with each passing day. But none of that mattered when Isabel, one quiet afternoon, turned her face toward the window, pointed with her small finger, and whispered, "That's the sun." Elliot broke then, his grief collapsing into sobs as he held his daughter close, the weight of years crashing down and giving way to the fragile, radiant possibility of a different future. Maggie stood nearby, tears streaming silently, her heart full with both love and dread, for the breaking point had come. They had chosen hope, and now the fight for truth could no longer be avoided. The storm that Maggie Sullivan had feared was no longer distant. It came crashing over the Harper estate once the eye drops were locked away and Isabel's progress could no longer be denied. Elliot Harper, who had hidden for years behind grief and silence, knew he could not fight this battle alone, and so he turned to Lila Brooks, an investigative journalist with a reputation for tearing down walls of corporate corruption. One evening, in the quiet study with its tall windows casting soft shadows, Elliot sat across from Lila while Maggie placed her leather notebook on the desk. Page after page of observations lay before her, times, dates, details of Isabel's reactions to light. Then came the evidence. The bottles of toxic drops Sarah Nguyen had confirmed, the photos of vandalism to Maggie's car, the financial reports uncovered by Elliot's investigator linking Novogenics directly to Dr. Leonard Vance and, most chilling of all, to Evelyn Carter. Lila listened, recording every word, her sharp eyes betraying both shock and anger. She finally said, "This isn't just one child's story. This is a crime hiding behind medicine, and the world needs to see it." Within a week, her first article appeared. It described a billionaire father and a devoted housekeeper fighting for a little girl caught in the grip of a corrupt system. Though it avoided names at first, the details were damning. The story spread quickly, picked up by national outlets, shared across social media. Sympathy grew, outrage simmered, but so did the backlash. Evelyn Carter struck back almost immediately, her polished statements calling the article a fabrication, her legal team distributing documents that painted Elliot as unstable and Maggie as a manipulative employee who had invented progress for attention. Anonymous accounts filled the internet with cruel comments, accusing them of exploiting a disabled child. Yet Elliot, once known for retreating from public view, chose not to hide this time. He appeared in a televised interview, Isabel seated shyly beside him, her crayon drawings on the table between them. His voice was calm but steady as he said, "My daughter is real, her progress is real, and the truth cannot be hidden any longer." Those words carried across living rooms and news feeds, and for many viewers, the image of a fragile little girl sketching a crooked son was more powerful than any smear campaign. But the more the truth spread, the more desperate Evelyn became. She arrived at the Harper estate one afternoon, her eyes flashing with anger, her voice sharp as she cornered Maggie in the garden. "You're playing with fire. You'll destroy yourself along with them," she hissed. Maggie's hands trembled but her resolve held as she replied, "The truth doesn't burn, Dr. Carter. It shines." The moment revealed the cracks beneath Evelyn's polished mask, the fear that lay just beneath her control. Days later, Elliot's investigator traced the anonymous threats and late-night calls to a burner phone purchased by someone tied directly to Carter's office. The circle was tightening. Soon the district attorney's office issued subpoenas for Novogenix's financial records, and whispers of a grand jury filled the air. Then came the breakthrough, leaked documents showing millions in hush payments to doctors who had participated in Vance's trials. The evidence was irrefutable, and the tide of public opinion began to shift. Families of former patients stepped forward with their own stories, each one echoing the same theme: treatments that caused harm, records that vanished, questions silenced. What had started in the silence of the Harper estate now roared like a storm across the nation. Amid the chaos, Isabel's progress became the anchor for Elliot and Maggie. The child once thought unreachable was learning to see the world piece by piece. She began to name colors tentatively, to sketch uneven shapes that carried meaning far beyond their lines. One afternoon she asked, "Daddy, is that blue?" And Elliot, overwhelmed, dropped to his knees, tears streaming as he held her. Maggie watched quietly, her own eyes wet, for she knew these fragile moments of light were the very reason they endured the darkness. Lila Brooks, recognizing the power of these small victories, featured Isabel's sketches in her second article. The photographs of messy sons and crooked houses filled the page, accompanied by the words, "This child was told she would never see, but the truth set her free." The article struck harder than any financial record or leaked memo could have, for it spoke to the human heart. Yet victory was far from assured. Evelyn's lawyers filed injunctions, lawsuits designed to bleed Elliot's resources and silence him. Anonymous threats grew bolder, security at the estate had to be doubled, and the family lived under constant pressure. But for every blow struck, there was a new swell of support. Lawmakers began to speak publicly, calling for hearings. Novogenix's stock plummeted, investors demanded resignations, and the Department of Justice confirmed an official investigation. Elliot and Maggie were called to testify. In the oak-paneled courtroom, their voices cut through the noise of legal jargon and corporate spin. Elliot, his voice trembling but firm, declared, "My daughter was denied sight because her suffering was profitable, and I will not allow another child to be used this way." Maggie followed, her words softer but no less powerful. "I lost my son to an illness I could not fight, but I will not lose Isabel to lies." Their testimony, broadcast across the country, moved millions, and for the first time the narrative shifted completely. Evelyn Carter, once untouchable, was now seen for what she was, a woman complicit in a scheme that put profit above children's lives. Back at the estate, away from cameras and headlines, Isabel sat by the window with her crayons. She held up a picture of a sun, messy and uneven but glowing in bright yellow. Elliot stared at it as though it were the most beautiful art he had ever seen, his heart breaking open with pride. Maggie, watching from the doorway, felt the same certainty that had guided her from the start, that truth, no matter how deeply buried, always found its way to light. And though the fight was not over, the Harper household was no longer a place of silence and grief. It was a place where hope had taken root, and where the battle for justice had already begun to reshape not only their lives but the world beyond their gates. The end of the battle came not with silence but with the sound of a gavel striking wood as Dr. Leonard Vance was convicted for illegal medical practices, fraud, and conspiracy, his carefully crafted reputation collapsing in a courtroom filled with reporters and families who had waited years for justice. Novogenics, the company that funded his trials, faced crushing fines and public disgrace, its leaders stepping down under pressure from lawmakers and furious shareholders, and Evelyn Carter, once so polished and untouchable, stood exposed as complicit, her career destroyed, her name spoken with scorn rather than respect. For Elliot Harper and Maggie Sullivan, the journey from despair to truth had been long and bruising, yet on the day they testified, their voices carried more than evidence, they carried conviction, and when the verdict was read, Elliot reached for Maggie's hand, a gesture of quiet gratitude for the woman who had refused to stay silent when everyone else looked away. The Harper estate, once a place of grief, slowly transformed into a home filled with life. Isabel, now 8, enrolled in a local school, her vision no longer perfect but strong enough to recognize colors, shapes, and the warmth of the world she had once been denied. She thrived among other children, learning to read with her fingers and her eyes, drawing landscapes in bright crayon strokes, laughing with a sound that echoed through the once quiet halls. Elliot, who had lived for years in the shadows of guilt, began to step back into the world, not as the invincible billionaire he once was but as a father restored to hope, speaking at conferences not about technology but about accountability, about the need to protect children from the arrogance of unchecked power. Maggie's role deepened in ways no one could have predicted. She was no longer simply the housekeeper who had uncovered a terrible truth, she was recognized legally and emotionally as Isabel's guardian and, in time, her adoptive mother. At a small but heartfelt ceremony, Elliot stood beside Maggie as Isabel clutched their hands, smiling shyly as the judge declared what had long been true in spirit, that Maggie Sullivan was now Isabel's mother in name as well. Tears rolled down Maggie's cheeks as she whispered to the girl, "I will never leave you," and Isabel, with the innocence of a child who had finally begun to see, whispered back, "You're my light." Years passed, and the story of their fight spread beyond Napa Valley, becoming a lesson told in classrooms, churches, and news specials about courage and truth. When Isabel turned 18, she stood in a San Francisco art gallery surrounded by her paintings, vivid landscapes of vineyards, abstract swirls of color, portraits full of emotion, and as she addressed the crowd, her voice carried the same quiet strength her adoptive mother had shown years earlier. "I was told I would never see," she said, pausing as her eyes searched for Maggie in the audience, "but someone believed in me when it mattered most. My mother's heart was my first light, and because of her, I learned that truth always finds its way through darkness." The audience rose in applause, and Elliot, standing with gray in his hair and pride in his eyes, knew that his daughter's life had been redeemed not by wealth or power but by love, courage, and the refusal to surrender. The Harper household, once silent and shrouded in sorrow, had become a home filled with laughter, art, and hope, and though the scars of the past would never fully fade, they served only as reminders of how far they had come. For Elliot, for Maggie, and most of all for Isabel, the story that began in shadows had ended in radiant light, a future brighter than they had ever dared to dream. And that's the end of today's story. If it touched you, comment where you're watching from, hit like, subscribe, and share. Thank you for staying with us till the end.